Juneteenth celebrations now across the country. The first nationwide observance of the day since President Biden signed it into law 2 days ago, making it a federal holiday. ABC's Marcus Moore is in Galveston, Texas this morning, where Union troops informed slaves of their freedom on June 19th, 1865. Marcus, good morning.
Whit, good morning. That proclamation read right here in this spot, and it was a historic weekend this weekend. I want to show you the front page of Saturday's Houston Chronicle. It features a quote from a descendant of slaves saying that for them, Juneteenth will be as important as Easter and Christmas as the nation pauses to honor that day for the very first time. This morning, joy, reflection, and celebrations in cities across the U.S. for the first time in its history, marking Juneteenth as a national holiday. Those celebrations began 156 years ago here in Galveston, Texas, when Union troops freed the last enslaved African Americans more than 2 years after Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. What do you hope this will mean beyond this celebration today?
Beyond the celebration, I'm hoping more people come unified, that we're allowed to be everybody inclusive, that it just doesn't stop by a signing of a bill.
More than a century later, those celebrations echoed across the country, from Denver to New York City to Missouri, where nearly 200 kids took part in a parade. In Florida, families walking for peace in the streets.
This is such an accomplishment. It's been a long time coming.
And back in Texas, crowds joining 94-year-old Opal Lee, affectionately known as the grandmother of the Juneteenth movement. For yet another year, she walked 2.5 miles to commemorate the 2.5 years it took for 250,000 Texas slaves to finally be freed.
This is what we're about.
And in Brooklyn, New York, a new sculpture of George Floyd unveiled. Amid the protest and unrest following his killing, Juneteenth's significance gaining national attention.
I hope it will prompt constituents, residents, and passersby to continue to organize, to mobilize, to march, and to educate with the goal of enacting change.
Back here in Galveston, we have heard from so many people about how this holiday represents so much, including the need for people of all backgrounds to be active in their communities and to vote.
Hi everybody, and welcome to The Breathing Room, a space where people of color and faith can come together to have our lived experiences acknowledged, to witness each other's journey, and to take a collective deep breath. My name is Kevin Holland. This is episode 8, and the title is Processing the Joy and Sorrow of Juneteenth, the Proximity of Slavery, and the Rise of Jim Crow 2.0. I was at a wedding recently and I had a great time. I was talking to a friend who said that she was going through a lot of deconstruction, reconsidering and re-examining long-held beliefs and trying to figure out which one she was going to hold on to and which one she was going to let go, and what new convictions she was going to embrace and which new ones she was going to not internalize. I was talking to another friend recently who said that they were appalled and shocked by the insurrection on January 6th, but that at least one, if not more, friends around her assured her that it didn't mean anything and it was no big deal and just let it go. And then, of course, this past Saturday, we celebrated Juneteenth. I was so encouraged to be at a virtual Juneteenth celebration with some dear friends, and yet there was this odd mix of emotions. Incredible joy over the celebration of countless people putting in years and years of work to make this a national holiday, especially when I thought about Opal Lee, the 94-year-old grandmother who for years has walked hundreds of miles to make Juneteenth a national holiday. Even this past year, year, she walked 2.5 miles at 94 in memory of the 2.5 years that the freedom of the enslaved people of Texas was kept from their knowledge. At the same time you felt joy, there's this lamenting and feeling of sorrow because it indicates that 156 years ago, people of color were owned by other people. I think somehow it's just jarring to realize that that isn't that long ago. So as I was wrestling with these mixed feelings, I came across this interview that I want you to take a listen to. It's between Zerlina Maxwell and Clint Smith, the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. He gave language for what I was feeling. I think it will help your heart. Listen to this.
Today, schools and offices across the country are closed for the newest federal holiday, Juneteenth. That holiday commemorates the end of centuries of slavery in the U.S. Yesterday, it was signed into law by President Biden, and it will officially be celebrated nationally for the first time tomorrow. But not everyone has been in favor, like South Carolina Congressman Ralph Norman, who was one of the 14 Republican members of Congress who voted against the bill.
How many holidays do we want? What's the magic number? This would put it to 11. Do we want 20? Are we going to do one for the Native American Indians? I mean, where does it stop? And this was such an easy no vote.
The too many holidays argument is just the latest in a slew of weak excuses to not recognize the entirety of our country's history and confront its difficult truths. Someone who has written extensively about our country's ability to reckon with it is Clint Smith. He's a writer for The Atlantic and author of the book How the Word is Passed. A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. I highly recommend it. Clint, Juneteenth, new holiday, and it's very different from other holidays. There are conflicting emotions here. I've seen a lot of Black people posting some funny things today about the fact that we are going to be doing this. The celebration is about the end of slavery, but it also commemorates just our ugly past. What's the right way to celebrate this new federal holiday?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we have to do is hold the both-andedness of it, that this is a holiday in which we mourn the fact that freedom was intentionally kept from Black people in Texas for over 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and over 2 months after General Lee surrendered in Appomattox, effectively ending the Civil War. And so we mourn what was kept from Black people, but we also celebrate the end of one of the most egregious things that this country has ever done. And I think we have to hold both of those realities at once. And when I think of Juneteenth, part of what I think about is how slavery existed in this country for 250 years. And Black people have been fighting against the institution of slavery since the day they arrived on these shores, which means that the vast majority of people who fought against slavery, who fought for freedom, who fought for emancipation and abolition, never got a chance to see it for themselves. But they fought for it anyway because they knew that somebody someday would. And I think that that's a lesson for us to, when we think about what it means to build a better, more equitable and more just world, that we fight for it not simply so we can see it ourselves, but because somebody someday will.
It's so profound to think about the ways in which you are fighting for future generations. And I think in this current moment, a lot of folks are like, okay, we have Juneteenth as a federal holiday, but it feels like we skipped over a couple steps. Like we skipped over voting rights and police reform and reparations, the list goes on. So how do we avoid this becoming a superficial celebration of America moving past its racist history when there's so much work left to be done?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is part of the marathon of cognitive dissonance that it is to be a Black person in this country, in which, you know, we make Juneteenth a federal holiday. And at the same time, there is a state-sanctioned effort in state legislatures across the country to prevent teachers from teaching the very context from which Juneteenth emerges, from teaching the historical context that makes Juneteenth possible. And so it is this sort of cognitive dissonance, and it is reflective of the dissonance and contradictions of this country. And I think part of what we have to do is ground ourselves in, and hopefully Juneteenth serves as an entry point to this, ground ourselves in how recent this was. I say all the time that, you know, the way I learned about slavery growing up was as if it happened in the age of the dinosaurs, right? That it was like it was in the Jurassic. It was the Flintstones, the Brontosaurus, and slavery. Like they all existed at the same time. But I tell people all the time, the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture alongside the Obama family in 2016 was the daughter of an enslaved person, not the granddaughter or the great-granddaughter. She was the daughter of someone born into intergenerational chattel bondage. And so this history that we tell ourselves was a long time ago wasn't in fact that long ago at all. And if we can remind ourselves of our sort of temporal proximity to this period of time, then we're more effectively able to identify how it shapes contemporary landscape of inequality, how it shapes our political, social, and economic infrastructure in profound ways.
I always think about the fact that none of this was that long ago. And, you know, given the fact that there are 100 years in between emancipation and voting, the ability to vote for Black people and Black women in particular, it feels to me like we still got to keep working because there's so much time in between when something changes and when it's a reality in the lived experience. And we talk a lot about systemic change. We're like, we need systemic change. And there's all this nonsense and conspiracy theories about what critical race theory is. But at the core of it, we're saying that racism is embedded in many of our systems, and we need to change that. How do we start having that conversation, and how do we turn our conversations towards the policy changes that we need to make that make systemic changes possible?
I mean, I think all of these things are in conversation with one another. I think all the time about how I grew up in New Orleans, and to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard. To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Highway. That my middle school was named after somebody who owned a Confederate leader. That my parents still live on a street named after somebody who owned 150 enslaved people. And the thing about that is that symbols aren't just symbols. They're reflective of the stories that societies tell. And those stories embed themselves into the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. So that's not to say that taking down a statue of Robert E. Lee or making Juneteenth a holiday is going to erase the racial wealth gap. Of course not. But part of these things are all in conversation with one another, part of the same ecosystem of ideas that ultimately, I think, help us recalibrate our understanding of what has happened to communities so that we are more able to effectively diagnose what communities deserve because of what has historically been taken from them.
Several things he said meant a lot to me when he talked about the proximity of slavery and that I can detach from it and think it was ancient history. But for me, it was only 4 generations ago. In all likelihood, my great-great-grandmother was an enslaved person. He talked about the both-andness of being a Black person in this country, where you have to hold multiple conflicting realities at one time and mixed emotions, the burden of such a painful past and the contradictions of this current age in which we live. But also, he gave me a lot of hope in sharing that our ancestors have been fighting slavery or its vestiges and echoes ever since 1619, and they fought for things that most of them never saw or experienced. But because they fought, we've experienced freedom. And so now we can fight for things that we may not see in our lifetime, but we know that those after us will experience what we fought for, just like we experienced what those before us fought for. I won't soon forget when I first heard that interview and that phrase, alternative facts. The cynicism, the gaslighting, the arrogance that you know isn't true and saying it as though it's the truest thing that's ever been uttered. And that is why, on the basis of a lie, random companies are being allowed to audit the votes of citizens without oversight on a completely bogus charge and save a handful. 99% of those in the Republican Party are silent because they know they can fundraise and gin up their base on the big lie. Who cares about democracy? Who cares about the rights of people of color? Who cares about truth? As I said before, what enabled all of this to happen is an ecosystem of nihilism that has taken over much of the country. Nihilism is a philosophy or family of views within philosophy expressing negation, which is denial of or toward general aspects of life that are widely accepted within humanity as objectively real. Things such as knowledge, existence, and the meaning of life. Different nihilist positions hold variously that human values are baseless, that life is meaningless, and that knowledge is impossible, or that some set of entities do not exist. Here's an example of this. The infamous interview between Chuck Todd and Kellyanne Conway, where the 2-word phrase that characterizes this era was uttered for the first time.
Did not answer the question.
I did answer your question.
No, you did not.
And it's still out there.
It does not excuse, and you did not answer the question.
I did answer your question.
No, you did not. You did not answer the question of why the president asked the White House press secretary to come out in front of the podium for the first time and utter a falsehood. Why did he do that? It undermines the credibility of the entire White House press office on day one.
Don't be so overly dramatic about it, Chuck. You're saying it's a falsehood, and they're giving Sean Spicer, our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that. But the point remains.
Wait a minute. Alternative facts? Alternative facts, 4 of the 5 facts he uttered. The one thing he got right was Zeke Miller. 4 of the 5 facts he uttered were just not true. Look, alternative facts are not facts. They're falsehoods.
A part of me is still in shock that we are actually entering a phase of racial regression where we're facing things that we thought were eradicated 60 years ago. I never thought I would see brazen, shameless, hate-filled people reinstitute Jim Crow thinking, laws, and policies in 2021, but it's happened. Of course, those that would criticize would say that I'm being hyperbolic and exaggerating and really nothing's wrong and everything's the way it's always been. So I ask you to join me in a thought experiment. In your lifetime, had you ever witnessed a president who lost an election and claimed he won one, even with Gore v. Bush in 2000? Had you ever seen attempts by lawmakers and citizens to try to actually nullify and overturn legally cast votes that had already been certified by their states and claim voter fraud with no proof in any other previous presidential election cycle? Had you ever seen a president lie and hundreds of congresspeople lie and say that the election was stolen with no proof? And by the way, that's the definition of white male privilege. You're believed and people go into action based on an allegation that you don't have to prove and that doesn't even have to be true. Have you ever seen people gather to forcibly stop Congress from certifying the winner of an election? Have you ever seen the Senate vote not to have a commission to investigate an attack on the Constitution and an attack on the United States? Remember Benghazi? Remember 9/11? Have you ever heard a president caught on a recording telling an election official to find votes so that he can win the election? Can you imagine what the right would have done if Barack Obama had done 1/10,000th of the things that his successor did? Have you ever seen hundreds of laws enacted by one party to make it harder for people of color and young voters to vote, claiming it has nothing to do with ethnicity and it's for election security, after the Republican Attorney General and countless others said that there was no fraud? I think that's the thing that's got me so angry, is that hundreds of bills are in process based on a lie that they know is a lie and the rest of the public knows is a lie, and yet it's still happening. Have you ever heard of non-government officials, private entities, gaining access to count ballots from different states just because they have some bizarre conspiracy theory and they're allowed to do it? Have you ever heard of that ever before 2020 and 2021? Listen to Chris Cuomo speak honestly about this.
McConnell and co. did exactly what we knew and you knew they would do. They tanked even the suggestion to debate the need to curtail state efforts to send voting rights back 50 years. They won't even allow debate. Nothing to fix, says Senator McConnell. Really? If there's nothing to fix, then why don't you say that to all the red states that say they must pass these laws to fix fraud? Why don't you say that to them? Because you're playing the game, and it is ugly and obvious. And I want you to hear the words of a leader made for today, nailing the reality of this moment. I think the tragedy is that we have a Congress with a Senate that has a minority of misguided senators who will use the filibuster to keep the majority of people from even voting. They won't let the majority of senators vote. And suddenly, they wouldn't want the majority of people to vote because they know they do not represent the majority of American people. In fact, they are representing their own states, a very small minority. Question for you, my brothers and sisters. Who said it? Chuck Schumer? President Biden? Former President Obama? Pelosi? Nope. None of them. Our current dilemma is merely an echo of the exclusionary tactics of a generation ago when this was first said. Listen.
I think the tragedy is that we have a Congress with a Senate that has a minority of misguided senators who will use the filibuster to keep the majority of people from even voting. They won't let the majority of senators vote. And certainly they wouldn't want the majority of people to vote because they know they do not represent the majority of the American people. In fact, they represent in their own states a very small minority.
Dr. King, a half a century ago. You know, we thought this battle was over, but it wasn't. The stakes are once again the same as then. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. pushed the Senate to overcome a culture of exclusion back then, a year before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, 2 years before the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But here we are again today, talking about a minority party using a filibuster to allow them to keep suppressing the votes of minorities and others. It is an existential battle. This is not about left and right. It is about right and wrong. And I don't understand how you can see two sides on this. I don't see how you can believe any suggestion that these laws don't do anything to retard anybody's rights. They don't really limit. All they do is limit to one degree or another. Just as then, a minority is trying to keep the vote as close to them as possible and lying about that intention. Listen.
Well, the biggest lie being told in American politics in recent weeks has been that the states are involved in a systematic effort to suppress the vote. There is no effort in any state in America to suppress votes based upon suppression of minority participation. There's nothing broken around the country.
If nothing is broken around the country, then why have 14 states enacted 22 new restrictive voting laws since the 2020 election, every one of them, in every instance, citing that election as a reason for this need? 389 bills have been introduced in 48 states, with provisions that to one degree or another restrict voting access, many disproportionately targeting voters of color. Remember, here's the hypocrisy, the people behind them. Yes, Mitch, yes. Those lawmakers who voted against H.R. 1 and S1, they won on the same exact ballots they now want you to believe are fraudulent. A third of you believe this BS that they've been selling you. That's according to a new national poll. And now they'll point to the poll and say, see, people think that there was fraud. We should address it. You told them there was fraud. Lie, defy reason, deny reality. Because the truth is meaningless when you are about fronting mere belief. This was a concerted effort to manipulate government institutions for Trump's personal benefit, period. We also know that while Trump was asking his DOJ to help him cling to power, he was also pressuring state officials in Georgia, remember, to find him votes.
All I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state.
And just to be clear, Georgia didn't oblige. Remember, he was told by a real Republican that there was no fraud to fix. That's your problem, Mr. President. Remember that? Any doubt as to whether there was any good faith basis for any of this was killed by former acting AG Rosen last month. And here it is.
There was no evidence presented of widespread fraud of a sufficient scale to overturn the election.
Yes, it does look like a hostage video, but it was what he decided to use as a backdrop. And look, it's the words that matter. We now have the proof of Trump and Co.'s perfidy. They abused their power for the worst reasons, period. The question is, now what?
In closing, I want to read an encouraging article from Facing South, the online magazine of the Institute for Southern Studies. The article was written by Benjamin Barber on June 17, 2021, and the title is Black Voters Matter Holds Freedom Ride Across the South to Promote Voting Rights. 60 years ago, an interracial group of student activists from the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, boarded buses to challenge segregation in public transportation. Although the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled in 1960 that segregated public buses were unconstitutional, Southern states ignored the ruling, and the federal government had not enforced the court's decision. The original group of 13 Freedom Riders, which included 7 African Americans and 6 white allies, left Washington, D.C. on a Greyhound bus on May 4, 1961. More than 400 people would eventually participate in the movement. Traveling from Washington, D.C. through the Deep South to Jackson, Mississippi, the Freedom Riders were met with violent opposition along the way. White mobs repeatedly attacked them, and local police arrested them for trespassing, unlawful assembly, violating state and local Jim Crow segregation laws, and other alleged crimes. We knew our lives could be threatened, but we had made up our minds not to turn back, said the late civil rights icon Representative John Lewis of Georgia, who was a part of the original group of riders. The violence and national media attention it drew forced politicians to confront Jim Crow. On May 29, 1961, U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy petitioned the Interstate Commerce Commission to ban segregation. By November 1st of that year, the interstate buses and terminals were forced to integrate. The Freedom Rides helped set the stage for the nonviolent student activism that would become a central part of the struggle for civil and voting rights for Black Americans. Now, with voting rights once again under attack, organizers are borrowing a page from that storied chapter in American history to raise awareness and promote policy solutions, including a voting rights bill named for Lewis. On June 19th, the federal holiday known as Juneteenth, marking the end of slavery, Black Voters Matter launched its Freedom Ride for Voting Rights to protest state actions to restrict ballot access, which would have a disproportionate effect on Black voters, and to build support for federal voting rights legislation. The Freedom Ride for Voting Rights kicked off in Jackson, Mississippi, made stops in Birmingham, Alabama, Nashville, Tennessee, and will in Atlanta, Columbia, South Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina, Charleston, West Virginia, and Richmond, Virginia, and it will conclude on June 26th with a rally in Washington, D.C. to deliver its message straight to Washington. That's so encouraging. That warms my heart, inspires me. I want to be part of that. As I've said before, God, help us not miss this moment. Help us to step into it. Give us the faith and courage to act. Help us to be like the Good Samaritan. Help us not to strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Help us to see that the oppressed get justice. Help us to see as you see and do as you say.
What did you say your name was?
Thanks again for spending some time in the Breathing Room, a space where people of color and faith can come together to have our lived experiences acknowledged, to witness each other's journey, and to take a collective deep breath. Be sure to subscribe to The Breathing Room on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, or however you listen. And if you like this episode, don't forget to leave a rating and a review. To connect with us, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram, or send us an email at thebreathingroompod@gmail.com. For The Breathing Room, I'm Kevin Holland, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode.